After studying this module, you shall be able to know the history of narrative analysis, learn definition and function of narratives, identify the narratives of loss and trauma, learn narrative analysis and narrative therapy. History of narrative psychology. The recent history in the study of narratives emerged as a part of general turn language that occurred in the social sciences in the 1980s. In psychology, 3 classical texts marked the specific narrative turn. 1. Narrative Psychology, the storied nature of human conduct, edited by Theodore Sarbin in 1986. This collection amounted to a manifesto for transformation of psychology. He contrasted the machine metaphor, which he thought underlay much of mainstream psychology, with that of narrative metaphor. He also strongly believed that narratives have ontological status, since according to him, narratives are not just ways of seeing the world, but we actively construct the world through narratives, and we also live through the stories told by the others and by ourselves. Also, in the book edited by Sabin contains a portion written by Ken and Mary Gregan in 1986 on the structure of narratives. They argue that narratives are social constructions that are developed in everyday social interactions. Gregan and Gregan also identified 3 structures which they felt organized many narratives: progressive, regressive and stable. Progressive, in this there is movement towards a goal. Regressive, in this is the reverse occurs. Stable, in there is little change. 2. Acts of Meaning by Jerome Bruner in 1990. In his book, Bruner argued that there are 2 forms of thinking: the paradigmatic and the narrative. The former is a method of science and is based upon classification and characterization. The alternative narrative approach organizes everyday interpretation of the world in storied form. Bruner also identified a number of defining properties of narrative, including the following. 1. It is composed of a unique sequence of events, mental states and happenings involving human beings as characters or actors. 2. It can be real or imaginary. 3. It specializes in forging of links between the exceptional and the ordinary. These properties help us understand the narrative as ways of constructing reality, of bringing sense to something that is obscure or unusual. 3. Narrative Knowing and Human Sciences by Donald Polkinghorne in 1988. This book was wide-ranging in its scope. Perhaps one of the most important features was opening up of Homiletic philosophy, in particular the work of Paul Ricoeur, to more widespread discussion within psychology. In his classical work Time and Narrative, Ricoeur in 1984 has argued that since we live in a temporal world, we need to create narratives to bring together order and meaning to the consistently changing flux. During 1980s and 1990s, the study of the narrative became much more extensive within various fields of psychology. In the Personality and Human Development Studies, Dan McAdams in 1985 proposed that narratives is central to our self-definition. Within clinical psychology, there was a movement towards the development of a form of narrative therapy that is based on exploring alternative stories. In health psychology, several researchers like Crossley in 1999, Murray in 1997 argued that narratives is an everyday means of making sense of disruption of illness by Smith in 2003. What is a narrative? A narrative can be defined as an organized interpretation of a sequence of events. This involves attributing agency to the characters in the narrative and inferring causal links between the events. Mostly, a narrative is an account within 3 components: a beginning, a middle and an end by Smith in 2003. It can alternatively be defined as a story linking events in a chronological fashion. It compromises of the interpretation of what we and others do. Narratives are overwritten with moral evaluative themes which are important in understanding how individual relates to events. In a narrative, there are changes that occur over a period of time which involves a character and some form of action by Howitt in 2012. Function of narrative. The main function of a narrative is that it brings order to disorder. When the author is telling a story, he is trying to organize the disorganized and to give it meaning. The use of a narrative is pronounced in everyday understanding of disruption. Example, Becker in 1997. People encounter several kinds of disruption on a daily basis. Such disruptions may include financial problems, personal problems, family problems, and health problems. These challenges in our daily routines encourage attempts by us to restore some sense of order. Narrative is the primary means to restore this sense of order. The central process of bringing order is known as implotment, to denote organizing of a sequence of events into a plot. The main aim is to give these events narrative shape. In the narrative, there should be interconnected sequences that can lead from start to finish. Narrative identity. Narratives also provide structure to our own selfhood. When we are narrating our stories to others and ourselves, we are creating narrative identity. Subjects recognize themselves in the story they tell about themselves. Every narrative identity that we hold connects us to a set of social relationships and also provides us a sense of coherence as well as stability. When we construct a personal narrative, we are connecting certain aspects of our lives and linking them with others. This reinforces the fact that our lives are an interconnected series of events. We need to learn to be the narrator of our own story. While we are the narrators of our life story, the actual pattern of our life and indeed the very structure of our story we tell are shaped by a multiplicity of social and psychological forces, both conscious and unconscious. By Holloway and Jefferson in 2000. Social dimensions of narratives. Narrative accounts don't exist in a certain, rather they are molded and guided by a certain social context. Although the narrator tells the story, the character of the story told will depend upon whom the story is being told to. The relationship between the narrator and the audience and the broader social and cultural context by Murray in 1997. Thus, the study of narrative breaks down the traditional psychological, social distinction and develops a more complex psychosocial subject. The narrator is an active agent who is a part of the social world. Through narrative analysis, we can begin to understand both the narrators and their worlds. Narratives are usually considered on individual and personal terms. They can also be considered on groups, community or societal narratives. Personal narratives are involved in the criterion and re-criterion of personal identities. These social narratives define the history of a collective and distinguish it from the collectives. These collective narratives overlap with personal narratives such that individuals can define themselves as a part of the group. The study of the narrative provides a researcher with a mean to understand ourselves and the world by Smith in 2003. Narratives of loss and trauma. The individuals who go under some kind of trauma and loss in their lives try to provide instances of how they often try to make sense of the events that they are going through by creating stories or narratives. A narrative of trauma and loss is essentially a written or spoken account of connected events with an underlying time dimension. It is a story which takes form of a story. A narrative would be a substantial life event or chunk of one's life, a sort of life history than it is about what happened. There have been many changes over the past decades and researchers through narratives preserve past memories from assimilation, misrepresentation, repression. Narrative analysis. Narrative analysis is a form of qualitative analysis which is dependent on the ideas developed in narrative psychology. Narratives can be analyzed using a wide range of qualitative methods. It is best reserved for analysis based on the theory underlying narrative psychology. Any data which comprises of narrative is suitable for analysis. Hiles and Cermak in 2008 list the following among the type of narratives. 1. Oral versus written narratives. 2. Fictional versus historical narratives. 3. Life story narratives versus isolated event narratives. 4. Crafted versus spontaneous narratives. 5th, public versus private narratives. According to Murray in 2003, the most appropriate way to collect data is through interview. He suggested two main forms of interview. 1. Life history interview, biographical interview. It might begin with a request that the participant tells the interviewer the story of their life, starting as early life as they wish, right up to the present time. Probes may be interspersed as appropriate to facilitate the narrative process. 2. Episodic interview. It is focused much more on the particular topic of the life history and seeks an extended account of these. The potential range of topics is vast and substantial. Example, one's first week of college. In the narrative interview, the informant is asked to present a history of an area of interest in which the interviewee participated in an extempore narrative. The interviewer's task is to make informant tell a story of the area of interest in question as a consistent story of all relevant events from its beginning to its end. Michelle Crossley, 2007, approach to narrative analysis typically uses interviews but is not confined to this. The narrative she uses are based on McAdams' procedure when interviewing for narrative analysis. McAdams' semi-structured interview protocol comprises of the following areas. 1. Life chapters. Think of your life as a book. What are the 2 or 3 main chapters? 2. Key events. What are the 8 key events in your life? 3. Significant people. Give a description of the 4 most significant people in your life history. 4. Future script. What are your plans, goals, aspirations and wishes for the future? 5th. Stresses and problem. Describe 2 aspects of your life involving at least one significant stress, problem, conflict or challenge. 6. Personal ideology. This is about the person's basic beliefs and values. 7. Core life theme. Looking back on your life as it were a book, what is the central message or theme that runs through it? After conducting McAdams' style of narrative interview or some other form of narrative data and transcribing the interview, Crossley's analytic method for narrative analysis can be used, which involves the following step. 1. Reading and familiarization, that is, process of persistent engagement. 2. Identifying important concepts to look for. 3. Identifying narrative tone. 4. Identifying narrative themes and images. 5th. Weaving a coherent story together. 6th. Writing up a research report by Howitt in 2012. Narrative therapy. People who are exposed to traumatic events have a profound need to make sense of them, and survivors of trauma may require professional support to help them do so. Sincere survivors often find post-traumatic thoughts and memories difficult to tolerate. Therapy can provide a variety of techniques for coping with them on a daily basis. Telling the trauma stories is one of the very effective coping strategies for dealing with trauma-related distress. Methods. Effective trauma narrative can occur spontaneously in conversation. These spontaneous events can provide reliefs but may on occasion occur in an inappropriate setting or at an inappropriate time. Formally structured narratives created in therapy sessions with the support of a professional who is trained in trauma are typically more effective and less disruptive to ordinary life. Trauma narratives may include verbal storytelling, participating in interviews conducted by trained trauma specialists, or the use of written descriptions. Benefits. Creating a trauma narrative usually takes over an extended period of time, but the process of creating is in itself beneficial. Gaining mastery is a gradual and progressive process. Every stage of telling the story will increase the sense of control over overwhelming out-of-control events. Expressive experiences also diminish distress by venting strong emotions and, over time, desensitizing survivors to their own stories. Also, there is a fuller realization that the trauma has passed and there is an increased resolve to move forward. Trauma treatment for children. The use of narratives for with traumatized children is a common therapeutic technique used to help them resolve persisting systems of trauma and return to their usual routines. Art and play can provide opportunities to tell their stories, use the support of adults to gain mastery over their fears. Some therapists help children develop narratives through art activities such as painting, drawing and sculpture, etc. Example, Trauma narratives are narratives that help readers gain access to traumatic experience. It can be reflected on a growing awareness of the effects of catastrophe and oppression on the individual psyche. The periods of war, colonialization, genocide, poverty, domestic abuse can be effectively illustrated through narratives. Summary: a narrative is a substantial chunk of one's life, a sort of life history rather than what has happened. In its classical formulation, it needs to have a beginning, middle and end. Narrative psychology is concerned with the structure, content and function we tell each other in the social interactions. Narrative analysis can be used to understand both the narrators and their worlds. There are various methods for analyzing such narratives, for example, Crossley's method for narrative analysis, etc. Examples of trauma narratives can be accounts of domestic abuse and violence.